his next birthday is going to be his 80th birthday, and he's slowing down. And I think part of what you're seeing here is his frustration and that of some of the people around him, because um, you're going to see, I think, more restiveness on the part of the Republican Party, including on foreign policy things. You're beginning to see some of that on Venezuela, for example, and on some other issues. So this is very, very bad.
Hello and welcome back to Superpowers, the future of global security here on Times Radio. This week I am joined by Eliot Cohen, who was Counsellor to the State Department underneath Condoleezza Rice, and is now the Arleigh Burke Chair in Strategy at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, DC. Eliot, it's fantastic to have somebody with your experience and expertise with us this week, because it has been quite a big week for US foreign policy and security policy. So let's get started with your reflections on the national security strategy. It is fairly safe to say that on this side of the Atlantic, it has been read with some dismay. And I wonder whether you have any sympathy with our European sensibilities, or whether you think it's about time that you find that someone finally put down on paper what's needed to be said for a very long time.
So I write a regular column for The Atlantic, and the title of my last piece was Trump's Security Strategy is Incoherent Babbling, which gives you some sense of my view of it. Although I've been quite a harsh critic of Trump personally and of the Trump administration for a very long time. So as you might imagine, I'm out of sympathy, to say the least, about this document. Let me say a couple of things about it, though, to help your listeners get some sense of context. First, the law requires that each new administration lay out a national security strategy. These are documents which are committee products, and I can assure you, as somebody who's been in government on a number of occasions and has been close to it even when I'm out, is nobody really pays attention to them. I mean, they don't actually set a course. They can reflect the thinking that's going on at the top, and I think in some ways that's true here. The document itself is incoherent and self-contradictory. I mean, I can quite understand why Europeans would be alarmed by it. I think in many ways they should be. But you can also look at it and say, well, but there's all this stuff about the importance of alliances, to include the importance of Europe, and there are things that look more traditional. There's also just a tremendous amount of internal contradiction here. I mean, one of the things that's particularly ridiculous is, on the one hand, the administration is saying we're not interested in interfering with other people's forms of government and culture. We're going to respect that. The one exception are our most important allies, the Europeans, and there we're going to tell them they should be just like Americans, which is ridiculous. Now, having said that, I think there are two big things that I would say about it. One, it does reflect, I think, Trump's overall worldview, to the extent he has one, which is that international relations is about deals. He doesn't particularly care about the internal politics of any country. He doesn't even really think of the United States as having real enemies per se. He has, they're competitors, but he frames it mainly in commercial terms. I mean, one of the things that's very striking here is the discussion of China, and it's really in commercial terms. It's not in terms of China's aggressive behavior in the South China Sea. I think so. That's one thing which is and should be concerning. The second thing is, as with all things Trump, there's always some sort of kernel of something there which is true, which then gets completely blown up out of proportion and distorted. But it's one of the reasons why he's a successful political figure. And in the case of Europe, I think what he's they've put their finger on is Europe being challenged by large-scale and, in some cases, uncontrolled immigration with populations that you're finding very, very hard to absorb. Now, we've had a very large illegal immigration problem, and to some extent, you can say Trump deserves some credit for dealing with that, but it's a different kind of problem because actually it's been particularly easy for the United States to absorb immigrants, even illegal immigrants, from this hemisphere. There are some other cases which I think are less true, but he's putting his finger on something real. There's one larger point too, James, that I'd like to make, which is, the U.S.-European relationship has actually always been somewhat fraught. I mean, don't get me wrong, NATO is unquestionably our most important alliance relationship. I think even this administration at some level gets that. We have much, much more in common than the things that divide us. But really, going back to the founding of this country, I mean, we're the people who left, after all. And given the way, we have different attitudes about what the nature of personal liberties are and proper forms of government and so forth, those are different. And even the history of the Cold War is fraught with much more tension than I think we tend to remember right now, whether it was the rearmament of Germany, for example, or the deployment of intermediate nuclear forces to Europe, or European attitudes toward George W. Bush, who is now regarded as a saint by the same people who thought he was Lucifer. Those tensions have been there for a long time. And what's happening is they're kind of coming to the surface. And I think they're particularly coming to the surface at a time when a lot of Americans are asking, not unreasonably, look, this is a very wealthy part of the world, whatever its economic troubles are. I forget what the figure is. It's got something like 20 times the GDP of Russia. Well, why did they need us to defend them? That's not an unreasonable question.
So, I mean, for what it's worth, I thought that the stuff about the sort of imminent demise of European culture was overdone, but it's not. It's in keeping with what Vance came over to Paris and then the Munich Security Conference to say in the very early weeks of the administration. And there are plenty of people on this side of the pond who are similarly concerned and would have politics to match. So take that or leave it. Um, I I I also think that, as you say, the commentary on Europe underinvesting in its own defense and security in the absolute faith that the US will buy out any deficiency in European defense and security spending is a very necessary criticism, and one that, frankly, as Mark Rutte has noted, that the Secretary of NATO has noted yesterday, Europe has got to break out of this stupor and start spending more money on defense and security. And even in the media this morning here in the UK, people were reflecting that the commitment that we've made to get to 3.5%, we may not be able to deliver on because our national health spending is so expensive. So Trump is 100% right to criticize us for that. But the bit, Elliot, that stings, and where I just wonder if, as a former State Department counselor, and all that you've done in foreign policy, did you ever think you would see a US national security strategy that effectively positioned the US as a sort of intermediary between Europe and Russia? As if both sides of that equation are similarly at fault and in need of US facilitation.
No, of course not. I mean, it's appalling. It's awful. It's evil in certain ways. Um, but my view about how you think about international politics is, after you get over your first few gusts of outrage, you have to step back and think about, A, where's this coming from? And B, what do you do to mitigate it, and some of the larger context. So first thing I would say is I read the Telegraph and the Spectator pretty regularly, but you won't find the tone is quite similar. Secondly, there's unquestionably a level of hypocrisy there. So there you have J.D. Vance, who is yet another kind of loutish figure in this administration, saying these things which are stupid and counterproductive. And where does he go on his summer vacation? The Cotswolds. Um, I mean, I've gone to the Cotswolds too, but we were walking the Cotswolds way. We weren't kind of swanking around in fancy country houses. Um, and then the third thing I think, and this is more serious and more important in some ways, is I understand this does not represent all of the United States and forever. So, for example, this is a little bit down in the weeds, but um, the new National Defense Authorization Act has a whole bunch of things in it which really run counter to the national security strategy. It sets a floor under the deployment of U.S. forces to Europe. So I think the floor is 76,000. We have about 85,000 now. There's money for the Baltic Security Initiative. There's money for other kind of European security initiatives. If you look at general attitudes to Ukraine, including among Republicans, they're overwhelmingly supportive. I mean, by a 2-to-1, a 2-to-1 margin. Um, I think what you have now is you have a very distinctive personality as president who has been able to intimidate most of his party. Even that is beginning to crack, though. And I think as we think about the future, I think that I've always felt that the most dangerous part of the Trump administration was going to be the first 18 months until the midterms come about, as they will in less than a year. And as it really begins to sink in on everybody, including the president himself, that he is a lame duck president and his next birthday is going to be his 80th birthday. And he's slowing down. And I think part of what you're seeing here is his frustration and that of some of the people around him, because um, you're going to see, I think, more restiveness on the part of the Republican Party, including on foreign policy things. You're beginning to see some of that on Venezuela, for example, and on some other issues. So this is very, very bad. The very last thing but it's not, this is not the end of the world, and the laws of political gravity still work. I think most Americans absolutely understand that the partnership with Europe is really very, 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 very important to us and something that we need to maintain. One other thing is, and again, I really yield to no one in my dislike for Trump and my horror at some of the things that they've done. He has been extremely successful in getting Europeans to up their defense game. And even if there's some accounting sleight of hand with the 5% targets, I have to say, I don't think you would see the European defense spending at the level that it is now and the trajectory that it's supposed to be on if it hadn't been for some pretty thuggish behavior on the part of the Trump administration. I just think that's cause and effect, whether or not I don't like the way it was done, for sure, but it's something real.
I agree with you, and it dismays me that that is the case. I think the Germans would say that Zeitenwende was announced in response to the latest Russian outrage in Ukraine and came in the Biden era. But
Yeah,
even
but
then,
even then, I'd say that the real Zeitenwende comes, I think to some extent it's coming now with really serious investments. I mean, that initial announcement of 100 billion euros, but when you actually look what Pistorius, the German defense minister, was able to accomplish under Olaf Scholz as opposed to what they're doing now, they're very, very different. And I think some of the difference here is people being terrified about Trump, alas.
I'm certain that you're right. In fact, I was in the Bundestag on the day that they were voting on the defense budget, and a couple of MDBs, the members of the Bundestag, were reflecting to me exactly as you say, that there is this really awkward tension between the cost of those decisions for other German public services that traditionally would be more politically sensitive issues like health funding, pensions, those sorts of things, um, versus the need to show the Trump administration that Germany was doing as it should. Um, and I think, Elliot, your analysis is absolutely right. That that whilst the tactics are pretty unpleasant to watch, and really right, it just feels like an affront to the global order that I've grown up in.
Yeah.
The reality is that nothing else has got Europe to up its game beyond that sort of language, and in that sense, all's good. But the deal that is now being thrashed out, the what's interesting is there's the sort of performance, there's the art of the deal, there's the belligerence that you would expect Trump to show to force Europe to spend more in order for him to show the public back home that the US aren't being taken for fools and their money is not being spent unwisely. But when it comes to the choreography of this deal over Ukraine, it is pretty remarkable to see Trump in, open court to say that, Starmer, Macron, Merz might not be worth meeting with in order to discuss. I mean, that's the full-on abandonment of a global order that has existed since the end of the Second World War.
Yes, but it's Trump first and foremost, and I think the way you have to begin by looking at that is what else is going on with him. Russia, Ukraine is not the most important thing in the world for him, and in general, I was talking to a very, very senior retired official, I'll put it that way, the other day, who had a wonderful insight. He said, the way to think about Trump is he's a day trader. Yesterday doesn't exist, tomorrow doesn't exist. It's whatever deals he's doing today. And what you're seeing now is somebody who's very frustrated because domestically, I think he is beginning to sense that he is in serious trouble. You've had a whole string of Republican losses to the Democrats and some near losses that shouldn't even have been close. Just most recent thing is Miami, which has not had a Democratic mayor for like 3 decades, just elected a Democrat by a very, very large margin. And all the tea leaves are saying this is a result of a kind of popular anger at Trump. He's been frustrated in a whole bunch of court cases. He is getting pushback from people who used to be his most fervent acolytes. And I think some of the frustration ends up getting channeled into foreign affairs, which is where he wants to make his mark. He now has a kind of a fantastic idea of himself as a peacemaker. That's why he has this false claim to have settled 8 wars, which is ludicrous. He's arranged some ceasefires. And so I think the result is you get this kind of explosion of frustration at the Europeans and at the Ukrainians. Now, he does not like Volodymyr Zelensky. He doesn't particularly care about Ukraine. He still has a kind of a sneaking respect or something for Vladimir Putin. He desperately wants this deal because he desperately wants a Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, I think it's as in some ways it's as simple as that. As always with things Trump, I think you always have to look at, okay, but what is actually happening? What is actually happening is the intelligence sharing, which is very, very important, continues. The arms sales that Europeans are paying for, those continue. Exercises in NATO continue. And I agree one should be alarmed. I'm alarmed by the rhetoric, and I think one absolutely should be. But you also always need to be checking, well, what is actually going on the ground? There are 2 other points. One is, I think when you look at American policy towards Ukraine, although I give the Biden administration credit for the way they orchestrated the warning of the attack and in 22 and the way they brought people together. They were way too timid in terms of how we armed Ukraine. The delays, both in terms of the pace and the quality of armaments, it was shameful, really shameful. And I think Ukraine lost its best opportunity to really undo the consequences of the invasion and perhaps even more than that. So I think there's plenty of blame to go around on our side for that one. The other issue, though, is okay, what really is next for the Ukrainians? They can they can continue to fight. Do I actually think it's really likely that they're going to be able to retake the occupied territories by force? I wish I thought it were, but I don't really see it yet. And the broad outlines of a deal where, you know, the lines are stabilized kind of more or less where they are. It's in some ways, I suppose you could say it's the Korean solution, but Ukraine is independent, really has full sovereignty. Is in this case, part of the EU, which obviously is critically important. And I think it's very important not to foreclose NATO membership either. That is, plus some provisions for the economic reconstruction of Ukraine. And that's sort of a plausible outcome. And the question is how you get there. And there are two big problems. One is I think Putin wants a total victory, and I'm not sure he's going to go along with any proposal, including the ones that we have. And the Ukrainians, quite understandably, are not going to accept an arrangement where they permanently cede Ukrainian territory to Russia, and they absolutely won't accept one that leaves them vulnerable to the next Russian attack, which is only a matter of time. And they're completely right on that one.
So there's a lot in that, a fascinating set of thoughts. I just want to pick up on two in particular. The first is this apparent tension between Trump as the day trader versus Trump as the second-term president in pursuit of a legacy and or a Nobel Peace Prize. The latter is about a sort of long-term impact of his decisions, and the former is about, as you say, the immediate decision in the moment each day. And I found myself, as you were saying it, reflecting on the Doha Agreement, which was the agreement that brought to an end Afghanistan, which Trump at the time said was, him brokering a peace. He has since blamed Joe Biden for everything that was wrong with that deal, which I think is grotesquely unfair on the Biden administration. And I worry, therefore, if he believes that Doha was such a brilliant deal because in that moment it gave the US a route out of Afghanistan, despite everything that happened since, how can he not worry that his rush to do a deal in Ukraine, despite the counsel of the UK, France, Germany, NATO, the EU, the Ukrainians themselves, might not end up looking awfully similar to Doha, where he gets to say he's got a deal in the moment, but the legacy is a bit disastrous?
He thinks all of his deals are brilliant. No, he really does. And this is not somebody who is inclined. There's no introspection here, none, zero. And so he's not somebody who's going to look back on his past record and say, maybe that was not such a great deal, which would be what a more normal politician would do. The pattern of behavior is an exaggerated version of what you frequently see with second-term presidents, however. That is to say, once you become a lame duck in the American system, your own party begins to move apart from you in a variety of ways because you will have inevitably done things that are unpopular, and they have to face the voters. And besides, there are people who think of themselves as the successors, and they begin positioning themselves. And the administration gets tired, and the people who you've picked the first time around drop out to either monetize their government service or get ready for the next thing. And so and you usually lose the midterms. And the other party comes in, and that blocks you further on domestic things. So you turn to foreign policy because that's where, in the American system, the president has the most discretion, and the greatest capacity for glory. There's a little wrinkle with Trump, which is I find very interesting. He has begun talking about mortality for the first time, saying, "Am I going to go to heaven?" And the first time, okay, that's a little bit odd, although everything he does is odd. But it's come up a number of times now. So I think mentally he's in a different place, in some ways than he was. And so therefore he wants this string of successes. He wants that Nobel Peace Prize. But I think he also is somehow thinking about how he will be remembered. And that there was always a frenetic quality to him, but it explains the frenetic quality of a lot of the things that they've done. So, for example, demolishing one wing of the White House so you can build a gigantic ballroom. Actually, they needed a new ballroom, but they didn't need to do it a la Albert Speer. Um, so I think that it's actually consonant with that. I also think, by the way, that it's entirely conceivable that if this just gets blocked because the Ukrainians won't agree and the Russians won't agree, he'll just sort of walk away from it and look for something else. It could be Venezuela, you know, or any of a number of or a big trade deal with China. He if he thinks this is just not going to go through, I think he'll just try to change the topic, which is also a frequent tactic of his.
Well, before I ask you about Venezuela, because I'm keen to get your thoughts, I just to wrap up on Ukraine, Europe, and that transatlantic relationship. What are your expectations for the next few days, weeks? Do you think that because I thought your analysis about the realities of the Ukrainian position are unfortunately really true. Like, it's hard to see the situation ever being tactically better for them. And I also reflected, because I was in government at the time that you were talking about, when you said that there was a moment of opportunity if only the sort of mobilization of Western industry and the lethal aid programs had accelerated to meet it. That is true. Um, so in some ways, you would conclude that, you know, this is the moment to do a deal because it's as good as any other. But I also agree with Zelensky and Starmer and Macron and Merz and von der Leyen that there is a line that Zelensky must not go beneath. Even his situation might not get any better, but it's probably not going to get hugely worse anytime soon. And to be forced into a really kind of punitive deal that positively advantages Russia is unnecessary. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, first I agree with that, and I also think that um, there will be congressional blowback, and some of it won't be visible, but it will be there. So that'll put a bit of a break on that. Look, this is a question only the Ukrainians can answer for themselves, and we cannot answer for them. I think it's worth thinking a little bit more, if I could, about the longer term transatlantic relationship. There will be something after Trump. It could conceivably be J.D. Vance, which would be really bad. I mean, it'd be bad from my point of view for the United States domestically as well, but I think that's less likely. I don't think we're going to go back to the relationships as they were before. I mean, I from a European point of view, the first Trump administration, they could say, "Wow, that's a really weird anomaly." Um, we reelected the guy. 70 million Americans voted for him despite everything that we knew about him. Now, okay, that's has something to do with Biden and Kamala Harris and so on. But I can understand if I was a European, I'd go, we simply cannot rely on the Americans. As I said, this is not, we should be careful not to mythologize what the transatlantic relationship was. At the end of the day, though, I do think common values and common interests, most importantly, will continue to keep us together in some way. It'll be a more nuanced kind of relationship. Last thing, by the way, one other thing I'd meant to say about the Europeans dealing with Trump on these issues. Let's remember his gusts of emotion come and go, and there are a number of European leaders who have learned how to handle him. I think Rutte is actually quite capable at that. I think Giorgia Meloni is pretty good. Alex Stubb, definitely. Um,
Bob's having a very low handicap in Alexander Stubb's
uh,
case. He's a great golfer.
as we like to say, whatever it takes. Um, I think Keir Starmer probably at the moment less so, in part just because of his what looks to me like a catastrophic domestic position in British politics, and God only knows what happens after him. And it's actually, from an American point of view, what personally one of the things that alarms me most is the state of Britain, because you are our most important European ally, and for a whole bunch of reasons, I'm kind of terrified about where you are and where you're heading. Macron, to some extent, although I think there are limits. But in any case, they've learned how to manipulate him, and they will come back. And Ursula von der Leyen, she's also, she knows how to say some of the right things. So, he'll be yelling and raving at one moment, and be enormously flattered to see the king again, and we'll go from there.
Yeah. Um, Venezuela, just last few minutes that we have, although I wish we had 5 times as long, because feel like I could chat to you all day. What is there going to be a war in the Caribbean? Is the US going to start bombing Caracas? Like, how's this all playing out?
So, I mean, it's a interesting question. One argument that I've heard is that the Latin America policy is really controlled by Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, whereas unfortunately the European policy has been kind of handed over to a bunch of people, including Harvey Witkoff. And that Rubio is smart enough to know what the history of American interventions in Latin America have been over the long term. I do think, though, that they've stumbled into something where they don't particularly have a plan, and where you can easily imagine one damn thing leading to another, as often happens in international affairs. If Franz Ferdinand had decided to turn around that car in Sarajevo after the first assassination attempt, World War I, as we knew it, may very well not have occurred. And so things, one thing after another can happen. There is a very large issue, and I think actually there are a lot of people in Congress who are quite concerned about this, about the use of military power to basically kill people who we think are criminals. May very well be, probably are, but the U.S. Navy is not a death squad, and it's profoundly illegitimate. The Congress, I think, is increasingly unhappy that we haven't seen what the legal justifications are, and they should be unhappy about that. And you're beginning to see a return to the issue of the necessity of a congressional authorization for the use of military force, which is a term of art in our system, an AUMF, for the use of force. One of the positive consequences, I hope, of the Trump administration eventually will be a realization that Congress really needs to reassert its authority, including over matters of war and peace. I mean, Congress has been part of the reason why Trump can do the things he's done. Some of it has to do with the latent powers of the presidency. Some of it has to do with an abdication of responsibility by the United States Congress, including on issues of war and peace.
The national security strategy effectively says that the US should be dominant and secure within the Western Hemisphere. And obviously, Maduro is not in the US sphere. But I was hearing from a Brazilian naval officer last Friday here in London, just, the sort of, there are plenty in Brazil that find the Maduro regime really unpalatable. But there are many, many more who find it a real affront to see a US aircraft carrier parked on the north coast of their continent, and the threat of US hard power into sort of South American, Latin American affairs. And so there's this danger that rather than strengthening the position within their sphere of the Western Hemisphere, they actually drive Brazil, Colombia, Chile, sort of to become more critical of the US.
All this stuff is counterproductive. I mean, no question about it. As always, as I said, there's this little kernel of something real. The kernel of something real that the national security strategy touches in this case is that we've tended to neglect the Western Hemisphere. When I was at the State Department, I came in from the outside as an academic for several years. The powerful regional bureaus were the European Bureau, the Near East Asia Bureau, sort of Middle East, and the East Asia and Pacific bureaus. Latin America and Africa, South and Central Asia, they were they were secondary. So there's that, and to some extent, what the administration is tapping is an old variant of American foreign policy, which is very much focused on the hemisphere, and that helps explain the Looney Tunes stuff about Greenland and Canada as well. But no question, it's counterproductive. Again, just to my caution always is look at some of the realities of what's going on. So actually, Colombia has a pretty hard left government. I mean, it is run by a former terrorist. Um, Actually, collaboration on drug enforcement and so on continues at the same level that it always did. My understanding, my understanding is. So, you have to look at the surface things and you have to look at the subsurface things. The truth is, Latin America, by and large, has always had a very kind of jaundiced view of the United States for reasons that I fully understand. So I think they've chosen a dangerous course of action. Now, if tomorrow there's a coup that removes Maduro and the democratically elected president somehow by some miracle replaces him, we may all step back and say, yeah, we didn't like the method, but the outcome is good. It just I find it somewhat unlikely that the methods that they're using will yield the result that they want. But it's conceivable that it might, but I think it's unlikely.
Eliot Cohen, thank you very much indeed. It's been a really interesting conversation, and I hope you'll come back on Superpowers again in the future. You have been watching Superpowers, the future of global security, here on Times Radio. For more of Times Radio's brilliant geopolitical content, please make sure that you subscribe to the Times Radio channel. To finish the year, there's the year in review, where I joined the team from Frontline to talk through what has been an incredibly busy year in global geopolitics and security and defense. So please make sure you look out for that next week. But for now, I'm James Heapy. Thanks for watching and have a great Christmas.